The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood before her bedroom mirror. Her hands trembled slightly as she applied the last touch of lipstick, the same shade she had worn on their wedding day 12 years ago. Today felt different, heavy with an unspoken weight that seemed to press against her chest with each breath. William had been unusually quiet during breakfast, his usual morning humor replaced by a distant stare out the window. The children had noticed too. George kept asking why Papa looked so serious, while Charlotte clung to her mother's dress with unusual persistence. Little Louis, sensing the tension in the room, had been particularly fussy, refusing to eat his porridge and demanding extra cuddles. The phone call had come 3 days earlier. William had answered it in his study, and Catherine had heard his voice change from casual greeting to something much more grave. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his face was pale, his eyes carrying a burden she recognized but hoped she would never see again. It was the same look he had worn when his grandmother passed, the same expression that crossed his features whenever duty called him away from the family he cherished above all else. The palace staff moved with practiced efficiency around them, but even they seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Mrs. Henderson, their longtime housekeeper, had prepared William's favorite breakfast without being asked, and James, their security detail, had been unusually gentle with the children during their morning routine. The entire household seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something none of them could name. Catherine had learned over the years to read the subtle signs that preceded major announcements. The way William's jaw tightened when he was trying to protect her from difficult news, the way he would unconsciously run his hand through his hair when wrestling with decisions that would affect their family, the way he would look at her with such intensity as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. This morning, all of those signs were present, magnified to a degree that made her stomach churn with anxiety. She had asked him twice what was wrong, but he had only kissed her forehead and promised they would talk after the morning's official engagements. The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing, creating space for her imagination to conjure scenarios she didn't want to consider. The royal calendar had been cleared for the afternoon, an unusual occurrence that hadn't gone unnoticed by the press office. Speculation was already beginning to swirl in media circles, with royal correspondents making subtle inquiries about the sudden schedule changes. The palace had issued no statements, but the silence itself was becoming a story. As Catherine descended the grand staircase, her heels clicking against the marble with a rhythm that seemed too loud in the quiet palace, she caught sight of William in the entrance hall. He was standing with his back to her, shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored navy suit. His private secretary stood nearby, holding a folder that William seemed reluctant to take. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the gold threads in the palace carpets, creating patterns that danced across the floor like memories. This place had been their sanctuary, their haven from the constant scrutiny of public life. Within these walls, they were simply a family, parents who worried about bedtime stories and school projects, spouses who shared quiet moments over morning coffee. But today, the palace felt different, charged with the electricity that preceded storm clouds. Catherine could feel the weight of history in the air, the sense that whatever was about to unfold would become another chapter in the long story of the monarchy, another moment that would be analyzed and remembered long after they were gone. William turned as he heard her approach, and their eyes met across the entrance hall. In that moment, without words, she understood that their lives were about to change in ways they had both hoped to avoid. The look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know about the sacrifice that duty would soon demand, and the choice they would have to make between personal happiness and public service. The black sedan moved through London's streets with unusual urgency, its tinted windows hiding the royal couple from the curious glances of pedestrians. Catherine sat beside William, their hands intertwined on the leather seat between them, neither speaking as the city blurred past. The silence in the car was broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio from their security detail. William's phone had been buzzing constantly since they left the palace, but he ignored each call, his attention focused entirely on Catherine. She could see the conflict playing out across his features, the battle between the prince who had duties to fulfill and the husband who wanted nothing more than to protect his wife from what was coming. The morning's official engagement had been a visit to a children's hospital, an event they had both been looking forward to for weeks. The young patients had been preparing for their arrival for days, creating artwork and practicing songs to perform for the royal couple. But as their car pulled up to the hospital's main entrance, both William and Catherine knew that their hearts weren't fully present for the children who needed their attention. They moved through the hospital corridors with their usual grace, stopping to speak with each child, listening to their stories, and sharing in their small triumphs. Catherine knelt beside a 7-year-old girl named Emma, who had been battling leukemia for 2 years, her bald head covered by a bright pink hat she had knitted herself. The little girl presented Catherine with a drawing of the royal family, complete with crowns and smiling faces. "I drew you happy because princesses should always be happy," Emma said with the innocent wisdom that only children possess. Catherine felt her throat tighten as she accepted the drawing, knowing that happiness was becoming increasingly complicated as adult responsibilities weighed heavier with each passing year. William spent time with teenage patients in the recreation room, playing video games and listening to their dreams for the future. One 16-year-old boy named Marcus told him about his plans to become a pilot, despite the challenges his illness had created. "You just have to keep flying forward, right, Your Royal Highness?" Marcus said, unknowingly echoing the very philosophy that had carried William through his own darkest moments. As they moved through their final stop in the hospital's new wing, the weight of the morning's unspoken conversation seemed to grow heavier. Catherine found herself studying William's profile as he spoke with doctors about funding for new equipment, memorizing the way he tilted his head when he was truly listening, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled genuinely, rather than performing his public role. The drive back to the palace was when the dam finally broke. William's phone rang for the 15th time, and this time he couldn't ignore it. The conversation was brief, conducted in the careful, coded language that royal communications required, but Catherine understood every unspoken word. The decision had been made at the highest levels and their input was not being requested. "How long?" Catherine asked when he ended the call, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 years, possibly 3, William replied, his own voice strained with emotion. "The Commonwealth realms need direct representation, and the situation has become too delicate for video conferences and brief visits. The assignment would take them to Australia and New Zealand, a full relocation that would serve the Crown's interests in the Pacific region during a period of political uncertainty. It was an honor, a recognition of their effectiveness as representatives of the monarchy, but it was also an exile from everything and everyone they held dear." Catherine looked out the window at the familiar streets of London, the city where their children had been born, where their love story had unfolded from university sweethearts to future king and queen. The thought of leaving it all behind, even temporarily, felt like being asked to cut away a piece of her soul. "The children's schools, their friends, our families," she began, but William squeezed her hand gently. "I know," he said. "I've already told them it's impossible, that we can't uproot the children's lives for diplomatic convenience. But they're not seeing it as a request anymore." The emergency meeting had been called for 4 o'clock at Buckingham Palace, and as William and Catherine walked through the corridors toward the throne room, their footsteps echoed with a finality that made Catherine's heart race. The palace staff they passed offered respectful nods, but she could see the curiosity in their eyes, the whispered conversations that would follow their wake. King Charles was waiting for them in his private study, rather than the formal meeting rooms, a gesture that suggested this conversation would be more personal than political. He stood as they entered, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his expression carrying the weight of decisions that had kept him awake for nights. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs that had witnessed generations of difficult royal conversations. "Please, sit," Charles said, gesturing to the chairs arranged before his desk. "I know this isn't what either of you expected when you woke up this morning." Catherine noticed that he looked older than she remembered, the burden of the crown having aged him in ways that the public never saw. The past year had been particularly challenging for the monarchy, with political upheaval in several Commonwealth nations and growing questions about the relevance of royal representation in the modern world. "The situation in the Pacific has deteriorated faster than anyone anticipated," Charles continued, opening a folder that contained reports Catherine couldn't read from her position. 3 Commonwealth realms are seriously considering Republican movements. and our intelligence suggests that a coordinated effort is being made to diminish royal influence across the region. William leaned forward in his chair, his lawyer's mind immediately grasping the implications. And you believe a permanent royal presence would help stabilize the situation? Not just any royal presence, Charles replied, his eyes moving between his son and daughter-in-law. The people of Australia and New Zealand have a particular affection for both of you. Your previous visits have been remarkably successful, and polling data suggests that your presence could significantly influence public opinion during this critical period. Catherine felt the walls of the study closing in around her as the magnitude of what was being asked became clear. This wasn't just a diplomatic assignment. It was a strategic deployment of their family's personal appeal, in service of preserving the monarchy's global influence. They were being asked to sacrifice their private lives for the greater good of an institution that had survived for over 1,000 years. "What about our children?" Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "George is at a crucial stage in his education, and Charlotte has just begun to find her confidence at school. Louis is only 5 years old." Charles's expression softened, revealing the grandfather beneath the king. Excellent schools have been identified in both countries, and the children would have opportunities for experiences they could never have in Britain. They would see the Commonwealth from the inside, understand their future roles in ways that traditional education cannot provide. The logic was sound, but Catherine couldn't shake the image of George's face when they had told him they might be moving. Her eldest son had inherited his father's sense of duty, but at 10 years old, duty felt less important than his cricket team and his best friend James, who lived down the road from their country home. "How long before we would need to leave?" William asked, though Catherine could tell from his tone that he was already beginning to accept the inevitable. 6 weeks, Charles replied. "The political situation cannot wait for a more convenient time, and every delay weakens our position. 6 weeks to dismantle the life they had built, to prepare their children for a journey they had never imagined taking. 6 weeks to say goodbye to friends and family, to pack up not just belongings but memories and routines that had anchored their family through the challenges of royal life." Catherine looked at William and saw her own reflection of reluctant acceptance in his eyes. They had both known this day would come eventually, the moment when their personal desires would have to yield to the demands of duty. They had hoped it would be later, when the children were older, when they felt more prepared for such a dramatic change. "We'll need guarantees about the children's security, their education, and regular travel back to Britain," William said, shifting into negotiation mode. Charles nodded. "All of that has been arranged. You'll have complete support from both governments, and the children will maintain their places in their current schools for when you return." When? Not if. Catherine held on to that word like a lifeline, even as she realized that when could be years away, long enough for their children to grow up thinking of Australia as home rather than Britain. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparation that felt both frantic and dreamlike. Kensington Palace became a hub of activity as logistics coordinators, security experts, and education specialists worked around the clock to arrange every detail of the relocation. Catherine found herself making lists of everything from the children's favorite bedtime stories to William's collection of vintage books, trying to decide what pieces of their life could make the journey across the world. The hardest conversation had been with the children. They had gathered in the family sitting room on a Sunday evening, the same room where they had shared countless bedtime stories and family game nights. George, with his growing understanding of royal duty, had listened gravely as William explained about the important work they needed to do for the Commonwealth. Charlotte had immediately burst into tears at the mention of leaving her pony and her dance class, while Louis had simply asked if they could bring their dog. "It will be an adventure," Catherine had said, pulling Charlotte onto her lap while trying to keep her own voice steady. "We'll see kangaroos and beautiful beaches, and we'll meet children from all over Australia and New Zealand." But even as she spoke the words, Catherine could see the uncertainty in George's eyes, the way he was trying to be brave for his younger siblings while processing the magnitude of change himself. That night, she had found him sitting by his bedroom window, looking out at the palace gardens he had played in since he could walk. "Will I still be a prince in Australia?" he had asked with the earnest concern of a child trying to understand his place in a shifting world. "You'll always be who you are, sweetheart," Catherine had replied, sitting beside him on the window seat. Being a prince isn't about where you live. It's about how you treat people and the responsibility you carry in your heart. The media attention had been intense but carefully managed. The palace had announced the assignment as a positive development, emphasizing the importance of strengthening Commonwealth ties and the family's excitement about the opportunity. Behind the scenes, however, Catherine could see the strain on William as he balanced public optimism with private concerns about uprooting their children's lives. Pippa had been her anchor during the most difficult moments, appearing at the palace with takeaway coffee and the kind of sisterly support that needed no explanation. They had spent hours going through photo albums, deciding which pictures needed to come to Australia and which memories could be safely left behind in storage. "You know, Mum is going to visit so often that she'll practically be living there too," Pippa had said, trying to lighten the mood as they packed Catherine's jewelry box. "She's already researching flight schedules and talking about becoming an expert on Australian wine." The thought of her mother's inevitable involvement had made Catherine smile for the first time in days. Carol Middleton had never been deterred by distance when it came to her grandchildren, and Catherine could easily imagine her establishing a second home in whatever city they ended up calling home. The farewell gatherings had been the most emotionally challenging part of the preparation. Close friends and family members had organized intimate dinners and afternoon teas, each one feeling like a small goodbye to the life they were leaving behind. Catherine's university friends had presented her with a photo book, documenting their 20-year friendship, while William's polo teammates had given him a trophy engraved with, "Distance means nothing to true friendship." The children's friends had been particularly difficult to say goodbye to. Charlotte's best friend Sophie had made her a friendship bracelet with both British and Australian flag colors, while George's cricket team had signed a ball for him to take to Australia. Louis's playgroup had created a picture book about his upcoming adventure, with each child contributing a drawing of something they hoped he would see. As the departure date approached, Catherine found herself taking long walks through London, trying to memorize the city that had been the backdrop to her adult life. She walked past the university where she and William had met, the restaurant where he had proposed, the hospital where each of their children had been born. Each familiar street and landmark felt precious, as if she were storing up memories to sustain her during the separation ahead. The packing had revealed how much their lives had expanded since becoming parents. What had once fit into a few suitcases now required careful coordination with shipping companies and customs officials. The children's artwork alone filled 3 boxes, each piece too precious to leave behind but too numerous to justify the expense of international shipping. The final day arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to match the somber mood hanging over Kensington Palace. Catherine woke before dawn, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion that had been building for weeks. She found William already awake beside her, staring at the ceiling with the expression she had come to recognize as his way of processing overwhelming emotions. Their last breakfast in the palace dining room felt surreal, like participating in a familiar ritual while knowing it was ending. The children were unusually quiet, even Louis sensing that this morning was different from all the others. George methodically ate his porridge while reviewing a list of Australian facts he had been memorizing, his way of preparing for the unknown. Charlotte pushed her food around her plate, still occasionally wiping away tears that appeared without warning. The staff had gathered in the entrance hall to say their goodbyes, many of them having worked for the family since the children were babies. Mrs. Henderson, their housekeeper, had tears in her eyes as she hugged each child, slipping small wrapped packages into their pockets for the journey. James, their security officer, shook hands formally with George while quietly promising to take good care of their cat until they returned. The departure arrangements had been planned with military precision, but the human element couldn't be choreographed. Family members began arriving at 9 o'clock, each one trying to balance emotional farewells with the need to keep the children's spirits up. Catherine's parents arrived first, her mother immediately taking charge of Louis, while her father engaged George in serious conversation about the cricket season in Australia. Harry had flown in from California specifically for the goodbye, his presence both comforting and bittersweet. He spent time with each of the children individually, sharing inside jokes and making promises about video calls and care packages. His own experience with major life changes had given him insight into what they were feeling, and Catherine could see him drawing on that understanding as he talked with them. "You're going to love it," he told Charlotte as they sat together on the palace steps. "Australia has the most amazing animals and the people are so friendly. Plus, Uncle Harry will come visit and we can go to the beach together." The most difficult goodbye was with King Charles and Queen Camilla. The grandparents had been an integral part of the children's daily lives, with regular Sunday lunches and impromptu visits that had created a foundation of security and love. Charles knelt down to George's level, speaking to him with the gravity reserved for important royal conversations. "You're going to represent our family beautifully," he told his eldest grandson. "But remember, you're also just a boy who deserves to have adventures and make new friends. Don't forget to enjoy being 10 years old." The cars arrived precisely at noon, a convoy that would take them to the private airfield where their flight to Sydney was waiting. As they loaded the last of their luggage, Catherine caught sight of herself in the palace's grand mirror, the same one she had looked into on her wedding day. The woman looking back at her seemed older, marked by the weight of responsibilities she could never have imagined as a young bride. The drive through London felt like a farewell tour, each familiar landmark triggering memories that played like a movie in Catherine's mind. Big Ben, where they had celebrated New Year's Eve before they were married. The Thames, where they had taken countless walks during their courtship. The parks where they had pushed their children on swings and taught them to ride bicycles. At the airfield, the final goodbyes were rushed and emotional. Catherine's mother held her tightly, whispering words of encouragement and practical advice about staying connected across time zones. William's father offered him a firm handshake that conveyed years of understanding about duty and sacrifice. The children received final hugs and promises from their extended family, their pockets now full of small gifts and letters to open during the flight. As they walked across the tarmac toward their plane, Catherine reached for William's hand, needing the anchor of his touch as they stepped into uncertainty together. The children walked between them, Louis holding tight to his stuffed lion while Charlotte clutched the friendship bracelet from Sophie. George carried himself with the dignity he was learning to embody, though Catherine could see the effort it required. At the bottom of the aircraft stairs, they turned for one final wave to the family members who had gathered to see them off. The photographers captured the moment from a respectful distance. Their images would soon circle the globe. But Catherine was focused entirely on memorizing the faces of the people they were leaving behind. The aircraft climbed steadily through the gray London clouds, and Catherine pressed her face to the window, watching Britain shrink below them until it disappeared entirely behind a wall of white. The children had been excited about the private jet during takeoff, exploring every compartment and marveling at the beds that had been prepared for the long journey. But as the reality of distance set in, the mood became more subdued. William had arranged for the flight to be as comfortable as possible, with familiar foods, their favorite movies, and plenty of activities to keep everyone occupied during the 24-hour journey. But even the most thoughtful preparations couldn't completely distract from the magnitude of what they were doing. This wasn't a holiday or a brief royal tour. This was a complete relocation of their family's life to the other side of the world. Catherine found herself studying each of her children as they tried to process the experience in their own ways. George had brought several books about Australian history and geography, throwing himself into research as his method of coping with anxiety. He peppered the flight attendants with questions about time zones and asked detailed questions about the wildlife they might encounter. Charlotte had started a letter to her pony, writing carefully in her best handwriting about the journey and promising to send pictures from Australia. She had also begun a friendship bracelet for Sophie, working the colorful threads with intense concentration as a way to maintain connection across the growing distance. Louis had fallen asleep clutching his stuffed lion, his small face peaceful in a way that made Catherine's heart ache. At 5 years old, he was the most adaptable but also the most vulnerable to the disruption in his routine. She worried about how the complete change of environment would affect his sense of security. As the hours passed and they crossed multiple time zones, Catherine found herself thinking about the families they were leaving behind. Her parents would be having dinner now, probably sitting in their familiar kitchen and missing the chaos that grandchildren brought to their quiet house. William's father would be in his study, reading briefing papers, and trying not to think about how empty the palace would feel without his grandchildren's laughter, echoing through the corridors. The flight crew had been carefully selected for their discretion and experience with royal travel, but Catherine could see their own emotion as they watched the family navigate this difficult transition. The senior flight attendant, a woman named Margaret who had worked on royal flights for 20 years, had quietly provided extra blankets and gentle conversation when the children needed comfort. Somewhere over the Indian Ocean, when the children were finally sleeping and the cabin lights had been dimmed, Catherine found herself having the conversation with William that they had been avoiding for weeks. They sat together in the aircraft's small lounge area, speaking in whispers to avoid waking anyone. "Are we doing the right thing?" Catherine asked, the question that had been haunting her since the day they received the assignment. William was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the endless expanse of water below them. "I don't know if there is a right thing anymore," he admitted. "Every choice we make affects not just us, but the children, the monarchy, the Commonwealth. Sometimes I wonder if we're preserving something valuable or just perpetuating an outdated system." It was the most honest he had been about his doubts, and Catherine appreciated his willingness to share the burden of uncertainty. They had both been raised to believe in duty and service, but parenthood had complicated those beliefs in ways they were still learning to navigate. "The children will be fine," Catherine said, as much to convince herself as to reassure William. "They're resilient, and they'll have experiences that most children could never imagine. But I keep thinking about what we're teaching them about home, about roots, about the cost of service." William reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining, in a gesture that had become automatic over their years together. "Maybe we're teaching them that home is wherever we're together as a family. That service sometimes requires sacrifice, but that the sacrifice has meaning." The aircraft began its descent towards Sydney as dawn broke over the Australian coast, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossibly bright after the grey London morning they had left behind. Catherine woke the children gently, helping them freshen up and prepare for their arrival in a country that would now be their home. As the wheels touched down on Australian soil, Catherine felt a mixture of emotions that defied easy categorization. Fear about the unknown, excitement about new opportunities, sadness about what they had left behind, and hope that they were strong enough as a family to navigate whatever came next. The aircraft taxied to a private terminal where Australian officials and royal staff were waiting to welcome them. Through the windows, Catherine could see the brilliant blue sky and feel the warmth of sunlight that promised a very different life from the one they had known in Britain. The moment that would capture the world's attention happened not in front of the waiting media or during the carefully orchestrated welcome ceremony, but in the quiet privacy of the aircraft doorway before they stepped into their new life. As William helped Louis with his backpack and George gathered his books, Catherine stood at the threshold between their old life and their new one, feeling the weight of the decision they had made settle around her like a heavy cloak. The Australian officials waiting on the tarmac represented more than just diplomatic protocol. They symbolized the hopes and expectations of an entire continent that was placing its trust in this young family. Catherine could see the cameras positioned at a respectful distance, ready to capture their first steps on Australian soil, and she knew that these images would be analyzed and interpreted by millions of people around the world. William finished helping Louis and moved to stand beside Catherine, his hand finding hers with the natural ease of 15 years together. In that moment, before they faced the cameras and the crowds and the overwhelming responsibility of representing the crown in a foreign land, they allowed themselves one private moment of connection. "Whatever happens, we face it together," William whispered, his voice carrying the promise that had sustained them through every challenge their marriage had faced. Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that had been building for weeks. The children gathered around them, Louis reaching up to hold his mother's free hand while George and Charlotte flanked their father. For just a moment they stood together as a family, drawing strength from each other before stepping into the public eye. The hug that followed was not planned or choreographed by palace protocol officers. It emerged naturally from the overwhelming emotion of the moment, a spontaneous expression of love and mutual support that needed no translation across cultural or linguistic barriers. William pulled Catherine close, and she melted into his embrace with the relief of someone who had been holding herself together through sheer will for too long. The children joined the embrace without being asked, creating a family huddle that spoke to something universal about love and loyalty, and the courage required to face the unknown together. Charlotte buried her face in her mother's dress, finally allowing herself to show the vulnerability she had been trying to hide. George stood tall beside his father, but his hand gripped William's sleeve with the intensity of a child trying to anchor himself in a shifting world. Louis, too young to fully understand the significance of the moment, but old enough to sense its emotional weight, wrapped his small arms around both his parents, his stuffed lion pressed between them. In his 5-year-old wisdom, he understood that hugs made everything better, and this seemed like a moment that needed the biggest hug he could give. The photographers captured it all from their distant position, their long lenses preserving a moment that would be shared around the world within hours. But for the family at the center of the image, the cameras might as well have been invisible. This was their moment, their private expression of love and solidarity before facing the public demands of their new role. When they finally broke apart, Catherine wiped away tears she hadn't realized she was crying, while William's eyes remained suspiciously bright. The children straightened their clothes and checked their appearances, already learning to transition between private emotion and public duty with the skill that royal life demanded. As they descended the aircraft stairs together, the Australian sun warming their faces and the sound of the welcoming committee's applause filling the air, Catherine realized that this moment would become part of their family's story in ways she couldn't yet understand. The image of their embrace would be reproduced in newspapers and magazines, analyzed by royal correspondents, and remembered by people who had never met them, but felt connected to their very human display of love and courage. Years later, when they returned to Britain and their children were grown, Catherine would look back on that hug as the moment when they truly became a family, united not just by blood and duty, but by the shared experience of choosing love over fear, together over apart and hope over uncertainty. It was the moment when the world watched in awe and saw not just royalty fulfilling their obligations, but a family demonstrating the power of unconditional support in the face of life's most challenging transitions. The hug lasted only seconds, but its emotional impact would resonate far beyond the tarmac in Sydney, touching hearts around the world and reminding everyone who saw it that beneath the titles and the protocol and the centuries of tradition, the most powerful force in the royal family was the same one that sustained families everywhere. The simple, profound act of holding each other close when the world demands that you be brave.